Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. Welcome back to Demolishing Political Myths. Today we have the pleasure of having back with us our friend Pascal Lottaz, who, as you surely know, is an associate professor at the university in Kyoto, Japan, and he also hosts the channel Neutrality Studies, which I recommend you to visit. It also has a Spanish version of it, which is called Sane Vox Español. If you want to watch Pascal analysis in Spanish, you can visit his channel in Spanish as well. Everything will be listed, will be linked in the description. Pascal, how are you there in Japan?
Hello, Ezequiel. Very good. The weather is super hot, and we're about to get a typhoon here, or having a typhoon. But so far, so okay.
Okay, we have very hot weather here in Berlin as well, but no typhoons coming for our luck. Pascal, last time we started with the most general subject, our discussion, and then went into detail. This time I would like to go the other way around and start talking with the most specific subjects. And by that, I mean talking about the situation in the Ukraine war with regard to the Kursk counteroffensive and the battles around Pokrovsk. And well, all these the entire military scenario that we have there, that it's changing a lot. Let's focus first on Kursk. How do you interpret this counteroffensive? Was it an act of genius or was it an act of madness? How do you see it?
Well, that was a huge discussion ever since it started about what was it now, 3 weeks ago, or almost a month ago, right? And it looked like madness because it looks definitely as something that the Russians didn't expect. And then we had a discussion arising, especially here on social media. Oh no, might it have been a Russian trap? Might the Russians have wanted the Ukrainians to do that and kept their defenses purposefully weak in order to basically bind the Ukrainians inside their territory and things like that? But um to me it doesn't look, or I would find it weird because if that was the case, it would be strange because of Vladimir Putin and um, the whole Russian narrative over the last couple of years has been trying to create security for their own people. So actually having Ukrainian troops, having foreign troops, and especially like NATO equipment that the Ukrainians are using on Russian soil is definitely not something that I think either fits into the narrative nor into the general framework that I see from Vladimir Putin, nor does it fit into the entire situation that the Russians were already had the upper hand and were already winning bit by bit in the Donbass and basically uh, do this war of attrition that they were working on, right? The biggest misconception in the West is that Russia wants to gain as much territory as possible. That's never what they wanted from the beginning. That territory was not the issue. The issue was the threat potential coming from Ukraine and the demand even before the 2022 invasion was demilitarization of Ukraine, right? And you can achieve demilitarization in one of two ways, either through a political agreement or militarily. And the Russians, especially after the peace talk, the Istanbul peace talks in 2022, where they almost had an agreement, after that failed, after Boris Johnson and the UK, the US intervened and said, like, don't do a deal, the Russians recalibrated their strategy. The first strategy was like, let's scare them into making an agreement, quick, uh, quick and sudden, but get to an agreement. And then when that failed, they had to recompose their entire army, the entire structure of mobilization. And then they went into a war of attrition, which is basically shoot down as much of the Ukrainian and NATO equipment as you can, on as many Ukrainians as you can, is a horrible strategy. It's a very bloody strategy. It's basically a World War I type of strategy. But that was working. It was working for them for basically demilitarize Ukraine and NATO, right? And regarding the fact that by the time Kursk happened, this had already gone so far that the Russians then started advancing bit by bit and actually taking these hamlets and so on, and getting closer and closer to the Dnieper, then trying to lure the Ukrainians into a trap inside Russia seems to me like something that I just can't fathom that the Russians do. So maybe in the end it will turn out that it was a trap, but I don't think it was. I more think it was a desperate act of the Ukrainian military command, and ultimately Mr. Zelensky, who had to sign this off, right, to say like maybe we can do something with this. And by now it seems a lot of commentators, especially on YouTube and in social media, agree that the idea was to take Kursk city and the nuclear power plant, and then play a nuclear bargain with the Russians, and that has failed. And now the soldiers that are there in these thick forests are basically trapped, and Ukraine has to support them, and it shows on the battlefield, because now the Russians advance much faster in Donbass, and they take entire towns now, almost on a weekly basis, and very important positions as far as I can tell. So it seems to backfire hugely on Ukraine, although the narrative in Western media is, of course, that this is a huge embarrassment to the Russians, a huge embarrassment to Vladimir Putin, and the long-expected public uprising and coup against him, maybe by some military people, is just days away or weeks away. I mean, this obsession that the West has forever with a regime change, one way or another. But to me, it seems that it only makes the situation much worse, because it drives home the point to the Russians that Ukraine is a real threat, and that this threat needs to be contained. And what I don't know is how easy it is, or it's obviously not easy for Russia to contain this. Otherwise, the Ukrainian forces would already be out. And what we see from the political speeches that Mr. Putin has been giving, and that they're also uploading on the Kremlin, is that they do some long-term planning into the winter of how to deal in these affected regions with this incursion. So it is something that Russia obviously is now doing the operational planning to deal with over a stretch of time. What that then actually means in terms of strength of the military, I can't really tell. But it just seems also to be something that's still difficult for Russia to handle, probably because of the terrain, probably because of the forest, and because of the these soldiers. These Ukrainians are working in little groups and so on, very dispersed over a relatively large stretch of land, and that's also for Russia is not easy to contain, because these people can hide anywhere. Is what I guess, but I'm not a military expert. So.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on this. I think the Kursk counteroffensive was the result of despair in light of upcoming defeat. So it made no military sense at all, with the only exception of this hidden goal of trying to capture the Kursk central nuclear plant, which, if we think about it, is so crazy as a military objective that they don't even dare to openly admit. But regardless of this defeated counteroffensive, Sersky recognized this somehow himself when he said a few days ago that it was not working as they expected. Before this started, you will certainly remember that Ukraine had started to show some signs of predisposition towards a negotiation. There were some sayings, statements of Zelensky talking about the possibility of starting negotiations without Russian giving back the former Ukrainian territory. He even talked about the possibility of a referendum, about the concession of territory in the name of peace. There had been also the Swiss peace summit, which was a disaster in many ways, but at the same time, it showed Ukraine that Russia had to participate in a future peace summit, and suddenly we have this. How do we interpret that politically when you are getting to or closer, seemingly, to a peace agreement? Suddenly you strike with this provocation, which naturally will bring Russia to reject any possible negotiation now.
Well, I do think that Kursk was like certainly more than one bridge that Ukraine burned, in the sense of kind of making it impossible to get to a quick peace agreement with Russia, even if the Ukrainians were finally willing to do that. I mean, as in, everybody in the West keeps saying, but it's the Russians who don't want to negotiate. It's like, no, the Russians have signaled from day one that they want to negotiate and they are willing to negotiate. It's the Ukrainians who have a presidential decree signed by Mr. Zelensky after the Istanbul agreement, the non-agreements after Istanbul failed, that now this decree forbids the president of Ukraine from negotiating with the president of Russia as long as that president is Vladimir Putin. And the Russians keep saying time and again, if you want to have an honest negotiation, then just get rid of that decree. If you get rid of that, then we know that now you actually mean business. And until and unless you do that, we know that you don't actually mean what you're saying, because while you say to the cameras that you want to negotiate, you still in the back don't do that. And this is something that I understand. It's like, okay, you cannot have these two things at the same time. I don't know. The difficult thing is to discern what is pure rhetoric. And a lot of this war, maybe 80%, maybe 90% of what we've seen in the media, especially in the West, but also in Russia, a lot is rhetoric, is meant to form some sort of supportive opinion for each respective side. And then the actual information that we can take out from the propaganda that we are being fed time and again on both sides is actually very difficult to discern. But this decree is definitely a roadblock in the way. And on the other hand, your question was about Kursk. So on the one hand, I must say this. Yes, it did certainly burn bridges. And I'm certain that Vladimir Putin and the Russians in general are now certainly less willing to negotiate, or will change what they will want in return for cessation of hostilities. I mean, it's really sad, but we are back at this moment, this Clausewitzian moment, where war is the extension of politics by other means. So right now, the question is, will the Ukrainians have something to offer to the Russians so that the Russians say, fine, we'll stop shelling you for something in exchange, right? It's really sad that we're at this point, but that's where it is. And I'm sure that this willingness to stop trying to destroy the military capacity of Ukraine is now lower than before. At the same time, I must say, Kursk is obviously, even if it was stupid, but it was a political stupidity. This was never meant, Kursk was never meant to allow Ukraine and NATO to go all the way to Moscow and take Putin out of the Kremlin, or have him shoot himself the way Hitler shot himself, right? That was not the point. Whatever they wanted to do something political, to have a bargaining chip. And if you do war, then that's what each side does, and you surprise each other nastily. So in a sense, all is fair in love and war. So the strategy and the political aim probably failed. But in a sense, I understand that the Ukrainians think at some point, let's pay them back the way they paid us. And what then makes this more complicated is that we know that this couldn't be done if the Americans and NATO didn't sign off on it. So it's not just the Ukrainians who said like let's fight back. It is NATO who said like fine, let's go in to Russia, and Russia will interpret NATO going in a whole different level from just the Ukrainians. I mean, if it was just the Ukrainians, it would be a different story. But it is NATO, and it is now NATO equipment on Russian territory, and this is very, very far down this road that the Russians have been saying from the beginning. It's an existential issue for us. So we are getting closer and closer to a moment in which both sides or might be willing to use nuclear weapons. And that's not just the Russians to keep the Ukrainians out and away and defeat them, but it's also NATO that now at some point might say we are out of normal shells, 155 millimeter shells. We are out of a lot of weapons, but what we still have is a couple of tactical nukes. And that's actually the analysis of a person I talked to this morning, Ray McGovern, the former CIA analyst, who said that when you run out of conventional weaponry to do what you want to do, at some point it becomes a logical choice to even think, about scenarios in which you might go nuclear. So we have a situation where both might be incentivized to start using low-yield tactical nuclear weapons on battlefield weapons, not the ones with which you destroy cities, not the strategic ones, but the small ones. But this can and will go out of hand. And Mr. Lavrov has been warning us about this last week. He said openly, we have tactical nukes too. Don't you think about starting this, because once we start in the nuclear escalation ladder, we might not be able to stop it. We've never tried, and it's very scary, and we don't want that. But it shows us that we are now again closer to that moment where one of the two sides might start using tactical nukes.
Yeah, you were talking about the importance of rhetoric and narratives in this war. And with regard to Kursk, which seems to be a political and military failure, however, it seems to be, from the perspective of rhetoric, a big success in light of the fact that 2 days ago, foreign European ministers were discussing in Brussels the possibility of lifting all restrictions to the use of NATO-provided weapons to Ukraine, which basically means striking with long-range missiles anywhere in Russia. This somehow makes sense in the context of your interpretation. Is this one of the steps going towards this escalation that could lead up to the use of tactical nukes as well, Pascal?
Yes. Unequivocally, just yes. This game of escalation. It's like a spiral. It just gets worse and worse, and the spiral is still turning. And the people who are working on turning it are telling us everything is fine. Don't worry. It's under control. The grown-ups are in the room. We know what the Russians can do. We can see right into the mind, right into the to both halves of the brain of Vladimir Putin. We know exactly how he works, and we know that if we strike the Russians right into the heartland, then the Russians are gonna revolt against their dictator and he will be out. These people are pretty much, I don't know if they are insane. I can't tell whether they are psychopaths, whether they believe their own lies, or whether they're pure dumb. But these people are highly dangerous. And the problem is that we have enough of these people, probably all three, combined, sitting in too many positions of responsibility, and they keep working on turning that got them a spiral. And it gets us closer and closer to the nuclear abyss. And the moment the atomic weapons will be used is the moment they will scream out at the top of their lungs, "We told you so." They are evil. Or if they shoot first, it's going to be like, "We told you so. They had it coming." They constantly try and constantly do pretend that they've never been wrong, that they know everything, and that the path forward is utterly clear. But then they change the path forward based upon their current interpretation, and they change the interpretation as they go ahead. We've seen that several times when the narrative had to change. And then they They try to make you forget that until like 2 weeks ago the narrative was completely different. It's really dystopian. The best example is what happened with how we just lost the president of the United States. I mean, until 2 months ago, Joseph Biden was like on every single title page of every single newspaper in the world, in the West. Sorry, the West is not the world, but it was in the West everywhere. And he was depicted as, you know, the front runner and the best one and so on and so forth. And then the narrative had to change. And within 3 weeks, the guy's gone. The guy is gone and Kamala Harris is in, and we are told that she has always been most likely a successor and so on, a torchbearer, and it's absolutely fascinating. And they do the same with this war. The narrative control, and this is not a cabal, a little elite of a group of elites. This is again the newspaper and news media in the West then starting to walk in lockstep. And even if they are surprised like a week or two at something, at the end they fall over and they go into the new narrative, like fish, like a swarm of fish swimming in a direction. And this is extremely dangerous because, again, the lunatics who still work on escalating this war, they're still there. And we only have few people like Mr. Orban or Fico of Slovakia and so on who try to push against this. But you can then see how immediately the wave swaps over them. And even somebody like the Prime Minister of Hungary is not able to contain this wave of insanity, and Europe is in the grip of that thing as well, just like a good part of the US too, of course.
Yeah, we also see this change of narrative in the petition or in the proposal of banning all restrictions to the use of weapons, in the sense that this was supposed to be a defensive war for Ukraine and NATO, and now we are seeing attacks into Russian territory. They are asking to have this long-range attacks, but 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, this was a defensive war. Now it's a defensive offensive war. Somehow it changes very, very rapidly as well in that regard. Let's analyze possible future scenarios, Pascal. Let's say that somehow this Ukraine war finishes without the use of nuclear weapons, without full-fledged, all-out nuclear war, probably because of Ukraine's defeat, or because Trump comes to power and decides to end NATO support to, or at least the US support to Ukraine, whatever it is. When this finishes, it becomes more and more clear every day that the tension, the background problem of this, which is the struggle for sphere of influence, or better said, the expansionism of NATO towards the East, this will not be resolved. So we most probably will have other wars, or at least other conflicts in this scenario, in this general context, in this scenario. So where do you think that the future conflicts, future wars could start? Could we somehow foresee some of the possible scenarios in the future?
Well, I mean, once this war here winds down, the question is, will it wind down as having been only a war of only Russia-Ukraine plus like NATO support, or will the rest of NATO be drawn in? And is the war gonna end after it gets much bigger, right? This might still happen. I know I'm going a little bit back now, but the only chance the Ukrainians have at coming out victorious is by drawing in NATO, is by provoking Russia to the point where Russia says, okay, let's bomb a couple of air bases in Poland and Romania, then trigger Article 5, and then have an all-out war, a really, really a huge one. And if after that we get to a point where we are not all annihilated, but actually have a peace agreement, then it's really hard to see where this would go. But if this war as it is now winds down, as in no escalation into a direct war with NATO, and the power distribution in Europe remains more or less what it is, and let's say Ukraine gets basically divided, everything east of the Dnieper is under Russian control, west of it is basically rump Ukraine plus NATO, and then we have some form of kind of political rearrangement and kind of a, probably not a second Iron Curtain, but at least a hard like Korean type of split. And the West doesn't change. Let's say Kamala Harris gets elected and there's no change of hearts in the US and in the heart of NATO decision making, then I would say that the most likely thing is that the NATO will try to escalate in the north, because there they have now a huge potential and they're working on that with Finland and Sweden and Norway. There's now new base agreements with Finland and Sweden. I think Sweden gets 15 US military bases and Sweden 15 and Finland 17, or the other way around.
I think the other way around, but it's the same. Yeah,
the other way around, but it's the same. It's like 30 new military bases, over 30 new military bases in Scandinavia. Norway is expanding its agreements with the United States and is stationing new weapon types. And you can see how Scandinavia is now being built up into something that if I was sitting in St. Petersburg, I would be extremely worried about. I would be very worried about this. Also considering that this borderland between Finland and Russia is forest. This is a very, very difficult border to defend if suddenly just like people start flowing over it the way that Ukrainian soldiers were able to flow over the Kursk, the border with Kursk. I would be extremely worried about that. This is a huge threat scenario. The other one then is, of course, that Russia might try to say, well, look, we're going to pay you back, but we'll pay you back your way through proxies in the Middle East, in West Asia, in Syria, and so on. And we're going to try to drive you out, and we're going to help the Iranians as much as we can, and try to get your stupid military bases there out. And we then see, this might be something, pinprick attacks, right, of both superpowers toward each other's, to where things hurt for each other. So a next point of escalation, something that I hope will not happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did, is if suddenly we start reading in the newspapers that, Kaliningrad has actually always been Polish, or has always been German, and saying like, okay, if Russia takes the eastern part of Ukraine, then NATO should actually be in control of Kaliningrad, which is of course an inherent part of Russia, but an exclave, right? It's surrounded by the Baltic states and Poland. Yeah. So, and this is an undefensible position for the Russians, right? Militarily, it's very easy to cut it off, and it's very easy to make life very, very difficult for the Russians living in Kaliningrad. I hope that won't happen, but we might see such tactics to then just damage each other as much as possible, and that would, of course, be horrible again for the soldiers and the civilians involved.
So your list would be then first Finland, second Middle East, and the third one would be the Baltic states and Poland. Did I get you right?
Yes, I mean these are potential places where escalation can happen below the threshold of using the missiles that all sides still have, and the much more advanced military capabilities, like the especially the F-35s and the material that the Russians have. I talked to a aviation expert about 2 months ago, and he said that so far the most advanced airplanes we haven't actually seen yet used by either side. I mean, the F-16s is an old plane. It's nearly 40 or even 50 years old. I think it was first used around the time of the Vietnam War or the first Iraq War. I forgot, but it's an old plane.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's not a new plane. It's a powerful plane. It's an old plane. And we've newer technologies on both sides, and what we've seen is that both sides have tried not to use that or haven't used it because they don't want to give away what they still have in case they need it. So the escalation potential is still there, also for direct fighting. But if it remains indirect, then probably through Finland and probably somewhere in West Asia, pinprick attacks in order to destabilize the others' narrative of control.
Yeah. Yeah, I also see it the way you do. I would add to that the scenario of Moldova. I think that would become very, very, very fast point of tension, as Russia might try to get the piece of land that connects what it has already taken from Ukraine with Transnistria in Moldova. And Moldova is not so far part of the European Union. As far as I remember, it's not part of NATO as well. So that would be, in my opinion, the first possible scenario within the framework of all the options that you just mentioned.
Yeah, you're right. And I forgot to mention also Georgia. The thing is, Moldova and Georgia are currently both politically stable in the sense that they are internally blocked, that they cannot swing to either side and become a thorn just now. I mean, Moldova is internally blocked because Transnistria is it kind of makes certain that the rest of Moldova doesn't go the Euro-Atlantic way immediately. And in Georgia, you have the Georgian Dream Party in power, and you have some form of somewhat of a modus vivendi that says we don't want to become a second Georgia. We don't want to become a second Ukraine. We were at that abyss, and it was bad enough, and they took away 2 provinces, and we have an ongoing conflict. But the current power distribution is such that they don't want escalation with Russia, while they don't have diplomatic relations with Russia. So the West keeps portraying Georgia as being in the pocket of Russia, but that's ludicrous. That's an idiot. Those are idiot statements, because the Georgian Dream Party doesn't have diplomatic relations with Russia, because they are saying, like, Russia is still occupying 2 of our provinces, give them back. And a Georgian colleague on my channel once said it, Lasha Kasaradze, he said it beautifully: nobody needs to teach the Georgians how to not like the Russians. The Georgians are not friendly with the Russians for good reasons. But they have a working arrangement. And the hope is that this working arrangement becomes better in order to go toward reconciliation. That's my hope. That's Lasha's hope. That's the hope of a lot of people in Georgia, and of course also inside Russia, I suppose, because that would be a best case scenario, right? Making more friends. But that is something that the European Union and NATO tries to actively prevent from happening, because they would love Georgia to be a second front. They would love them to help more, and they told Georgia so much, and they said, your NGO law that is keeping us out of your country and makes sure that we have a hard time to influence your political process. That's horrible. That's a pro-Russian law. And Georgia will have elections in 2 months, October 26th, and the media narrative in inside Georgia is dominated to a good part, according to my colleague there, by pro-NATO messaging of, like, only NATO can give us hope, we need to become a member of NATO. You know, the dumb stuff that already got the Ukraine war going. So a lot will depend on what happens there. And we've seen that there were attempts, especially during this NGO law discussions 2 or 3 months ago, there were attempts at color revolutions, but they can't get that big. The support is actually not there on the street. But I am pretty certain that the experts in the West, mostly in the US, who have became very skillful at color revolutions, that they're doing everything they can to support that underground. And they already have, I mean, there is a president, the current president of Georgia, who's a figurehead. She's not in charge, but she's, she's the representative of the state. She's a little bit like the president of Germany, right? More or less the same, the head of state, but not head of government. And she is, thoroughly in the pocket of the transatlanticists, and you can see beautifully how she could be built up to be a, you know, how she could take over this ship of the state and be like she is already being glorified in the West. So there are figures in place, and this might become a way that Georgia goes. I hope it doesn't, because reconciliations with Russia and a working agreement with the European Union in order to have economic relations with both would be in the best interest of that country and of European reconciliation. But it might become a flashpoint, actually, and a very important one that I forgot.
Yeah, you're talking about Surabichvili, right?
Yeah.
This
French-born.
How funny French Georgian president, who I think she visited Georgia for the first time when she was in her 30s or something like that. But so far, her government and the Georgia's position, I agree with you on that as well, has been anti-Russian but not dumb. So they have avoided a direct confrontation. I would also add, as a possible scenario, now Armenia, because Pashinyan is making everything he can in order to somehow cut an historical link between Armenia and Russia and the Soviet Union in the past as well, and bringing Armenia into the hands of the West. This would be dangerous as well, because in all these scenarios, Georgia, Armenia, Moldova, we could have a war just like in Ukraine without the need of a direct, immediate confrontation with a NATO country. So those scenarios, I think, could come first before going to the other that you very well described with regard to Finland, Baltic, and Poland as well, right? In any case, it's somehow sad, Pascal, that we are in a war with the possibility of an escalation. And even when we think of the future, if this war ends, that we are still thinking of new wars coming. This is really a sad and crazy thing, right?
Yeah, and we didn't even touch on the Pacific, right? Where we know that that certain powers in Washington are itching for a war with China, where we know that there's a huge potential with the Philippines and with especially around Taiwan. And we didn't even touch on the genocide that's still going on in Gaza, and this utter this utter despair and of the Palestinians that they're in, and you know that's all the things that we didn't even touch on, and then that still leaves out Africa, where we also have ongoing wars, and we have clearly the indications of these great powers trying to start increase the influence in Africa. I think especially France and the United States are realizing now that they have neglected Africa, and that the Russians are liked much more over there than the French and even the Americans, and this has another huge potential to blow up in several places beyond the warfare that's already going on, right? Yeah, it's anything but a stable situation. The only thing I can hope for is that we get to the point where we somehow get again working arrangements among the great powers, especially the US, that might at some point agree that trying to push for regime change and for you know, just extend their power into every single corner of the world might not be the best strategy, but that you better try to build a stable roof, right? Where each one pushes against each other, but you get a stable roof done with that, and have some sort of, you know, 19th century concert type of situation where you have small wars and conflicts going, but we can at least avert the big ones. And don't get me wrong, you know, at the moment, we haven't had the big one yet. We are still working on trying not to have the little ones blow up into huge ones. But even those little ones by now are killing hundreds of thousands in the low millions at the moment. And this might get worse. So I hope it won't. That's why we need to stabilize the situation through diplomacy. And I can't understand why we Europeans do not try to work harder on that, and why this mental prison has engulfed us so strongly, where, you know, a narrative becomes everything, and realism to resolve and avert nuclear exchange is actually less important than maintaining the narrative. And this is something that drives me crazy, I'm telling you.
Yeah. When thinking about the future, the case of Gaza, or in more general terms, the case of Palestine, it's even more heartbreaking, because regardless of the result in the US elections, we know that both candidates will continue to support the massacre that we are seeing there. It's the only thing, probably the only thing they agree on, this endless, limitless support to the massacre that Israel is committing there. With regard to Ukraine and China, there seems to be some differences between the two candidates. We talked a little bit about this in our last discussion, but some things have changed since then. And I mean, between the candidacy of Donald Trump and now the candidacy of Kamala Harris. When we talked last time, Biden was still candidate, and Trump has selected J.D. Vance as his vice president as well, in between our both our latest discussion and this one now. Do you think that something has changed? Do you think that Trump has solidified this position with regard to Ukraine in case he becomes president? Do you think that he still has the same chances or positive chances of becoming elected? Do you think that he will make the situation, the conflict with China bigger? What do you think of Kamala Harris? Give me an overview of your view with regard to the US now, Pascal, please.
Well, we learned something very important about the US recently, and that is how easy it is for the leadership of the Democratic Party to exchange the figurehead, the president of the United States, right? I mean, Joe Biden didn't want to leave. He didn't. He said so clearly several times. And then he was exchanged anyhow. And he was exchanged with his vice president, which is like a straightforward choice. I think it's it would have been very hard to get around Kamala Harris, just because Kamala Harris could have been very destructive had she chosen to do that. On the other hand, Kamala Harris is a very weak personality. I mean, she has never had any important limelight. Not even, I mean, if you think about the people in the last 3.5 years who were constantly in the limelight, I mean, it was certainly Joe Biden, but then it was his Secretary of State, Blinken, and even his National Security Advisor, Mr. Sullivan, got way more exposure in terms of international politics, and that we see from the outside than Kamala Harris does. Maybe that's different for the inside of the US, but Kamala Harris has never been a strong and well visible politician, even in internal matters, right? So this is strange. And now also she gave her first real news interview the other day, and she took along her vice president pick, and I cannot imagine that she is a strong personality. So she is somebody who is easy to guide along the way that the Democratic Party leadership wants her to go. And it will be the same, if she gets reelected, it will be the same group of people who will just continue having their offices in the White House. You will exchange 2 or 3 and you will have a new cabinet, but the people below are going to be exactly the same. And I cannot imagine that US foreign policy will have any significant shift. By significant shift, I mean either on Ukraine or on China or on Gaza. I mean, there will be nothing significant there. It will just continue. It will roll on as if nothing had happened. If Donald Trump gets elected, then then I think that's a different story, because by now the big question was, who would he pick as his vice president? Because last time he was elected, he had like similar goals, but then he immediately chose Mike Pompeo as his foreign secretary. Mike Pompeo is one of the worst neocons you can imagine, right? There's no difference between between Pompeo and Blinken. This is same group of people and mindset, and he filled his cabinet with the worst swamp creatures there are, including the goddamn walrus, Bolton, yeah. Really, like the worst and most belligerent people that Washington has to offer. So this time the question was, would he team up again with a neocon? And an obvious pick would have been Nikki Haley, right? Who was already his UN ambassador when he was there, and then she was a strong contender against him, basically the last one standing. And she's a woman, she would have ticked off a lot of boxes, and she would have especially kept the neocon side of the Republican Party at least a little bit close to him. But he chose the opposite. He chose Mike Vance, who has actually on foreign policy a very sane approach. Except for actually on Gaza, I don't know. I just know Trump is on Gaza, just as hawkish and just as pro-Israel as Kamala Harris is. But on the other sides, on the other scenarios, it seems that this team is more willing to have a working arrangement, even if it's not friendly ties, but a working arrangement with the Russians and the Chinese, it seems. But again, until we then see who else is going to be appointed, the Secretary of State and the heads of the different ministries, we can't tell for certain. But it looks as if Trump understands the internal mechanics of Washington much better now, 8 or 10 years since he first set foot into the actual political circus. He's always been connected to it, but as a donor and as an affiliate, but not as a political actor himself. So it seems to me he understands it better, and maybe it's just a hope in me that thinks that if he gets elected, maybe US foreign policy becomes a bit more realistic and a bit more restrained. Because under Kamala Harris, it's sure that it won't. And it's also very interesting that we have seen a complete migration, right? The Democrats used to be the party of pro-peace and, anti-Vietnam War and so on and so forth. And anti-war, and that completely changed. The pro-war party is now the Democrats, and even all the Republican neocons, they migrated to the Democrats, and the Democratic peaceniks, the people I like, they migrated to the Republicans. Most obviously, Tulsi Gabbard. She was a die-hard Democrat, right? And she's now openly supporting Donald Trump, and the other one is Kennedy, who officially now supports Donald Trump, because they both think that Donald Trump is probably the only chance we have to get out this worst of group that we have, even if they used not to be or still have disagreements with Trump. And the interesting thing is they say so. They say we don't agree on everything, but we agree on enough to work together, and that is fine for them. For Democrats, this is a huge sin, right? You cannot do that. You need to subscribe 100% to every single word Kamala Harris and the Democratic leadership says. This sense is not really allowed anymore within the Democrats, at least not to a useful level. Within the Republican Party, at least the new Republican Party we have now, it seems that this sense between individual actors is still encouraged. You can still work with each other. You can also see that in the way that Tucker Carlson, for instance, leads his discussions and says, like, I have disagreements with people, but I can accept that these disagreements are there, and we can still work together in certain areas. So that's now a right-wing feature of the system, and not a left-wing anymore, which is very fascinating. But in a sense, we've just seen an inversion of the poles. And that's why the Democrats are now pro-censorship. That's why they are pro-war. the war mentality has shifted from the Republicans to the Democrats, and they're now wreaking havoc in the same way that it used to do like 45 years ago within the Republicans, and it is poisoning what the Democrats used to be. I'm pretty certain if some of the great ones, especially like JFK or so, they would probably not recognize their old party. And that's not to say JFK was a good guy. JFK was also a hawk, although his Kennedy Jr. tries to portray him as one of these great peace-loving presidents. I mean, he had his bad sides too, but not to the extent that we're seeing today, where the neocons really do still believe that it's total control of the world or nothing.
Yeah, we also see this inversion, Pascal, with regard to a working class friendly agenda. Incredibly, the Republicans now are turning into a popular conservative party, while the Democrats are becoming more and more the party of Wall Street and Silicon Valley and the big pharma company and the big corporations. We have agreed to limit the time of this chat, this discussion, to around an hour. So I will give you to finish as usual, as we usually do, Pascal, the microphone, so that you have the last words to close this very nice conversation that we've had.
Well, thank you very much. We touched on a lot of ground. Maybe one thing I would like to add is that there is good reasons for hope as well. It's not all doom and gloom. We don't know where these political forces inside the US and also in Europe will take us, but we also have counter reactions. I mean, in Switzerland, we have people who work on neutrality initiative. We have in Georgia people who work on reconciliation with Russia. We have Viktor Orban, who has just one of the last great peace statesmen of Europe, and I've never thought I would say that, because I dislike him very much for all of his immigration policies. I don't like that. I'm on the other side, but again, if he tries to help avert a third world war, then I will work with anyone who does that. So this was fantastic. The Chinese have been trying to come out with ideas for how to get back to peace. Southeast Asia is looking very closely at what's happening in Europe, and they have come to the decision we never want to be anything like the EU. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, for the longest time has been compared to the European Union, and was always told, oh, you're just so weak because you're so disunited, and you should be more like the EU. And by now, nobody in ASEAN would even dream of still wanting to be like the EU, because we're seeing how this project is failing and collapsing in front of our eyes, and they are discovering their strengths through sovereign cooperation, but not integration. And BRICS works in the same way. We're seeing that new models of cooperation are being developed, that new technologies are being developed in order new infrastructure, especially banking infrastructure, that this power that used to rest in Washington and New York is slowly, not slowly, it is already a multipolar one. This brings up very new challenges, and of course this is dangerous, but on the other hand, it also gives the opportunity or the possibility for a maybe more stable future to develop once this idea, this mindset, this very European mindset, that comes from the United States, that comes from NATO, that domination is the only thing that works. Once that goes away, and I'm hopeful that will fade away gradually over, it will still take decades, but I hope that it will go away once the reality sets in that we have these other power centers and they're there. You can't just wish them away, and you cannot just regime change them away. I don't believe that will work. So in a sense, I would say that we A, have to hope that things get better, and B, try within our own little means to push at least a little bit into the right direction, and hope that together we get a wave bigger than the other wave of the stupid idiots. And I'll close with that.
Pascal, it's great to close on this a little bit more positive note. Thank you very much again, and I hope to see you back in our channel soon in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.